Welcome to another deep dive today. We're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper, but
Hmm.
not in the way that you might expect.
Oh,
Yeah, we're going beyond the mystery of who he was, and instead, we're focusing on the lives of his victims.
interesting.
Yeah, that they're often just footnotes in the whole, the Ripper story,
Right.
and reduced to that label, prostitutes. Which, we're going to be digging into that a lot today. But for this deep dive, we're using Hallie Rubenhold's book, The Five.
Oh, fantastic book.
Yeah, to really kind of unpack their stories
Yeah.
and understand them as people.
And Rubenhold really does a fantastic job in that book of dismantling that label of prostitute and showing how it was really used as a catch-all term for any woman who was struggling in poverty,
Yeah.
particularly those who are living in lodging houses.
Right. So it wasn't necessarily about whether they were actually engaging in sex work, but more about their social standing.
Yep.
It's pretty shocking how easily these assumptions were made about these women. Like Polly Nichols, for example. She
Yeah.
was the first victim. And her story really highlights this, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The inquest into Polly Nichols' death relied very heavily on testimony that was really aimed at, painting her as this fallen woman.
Mm-hmm.
They focused a lot on the fact that she stayed in lodging houses and assumed that any money that she had, that DOS money, must have come from prostitution.
Goss money. I'm not familiar with that term.
Yeah.
What did that mean in Victorian England?
Well, DOS was just the slang for like a cheap bed in a lodging house.
Okay.
So DOS money was simply the cost of, a night's shelter.
Okay, got it.
Essentially, the assumption was, well, if a woman in poverty has any money at all, she must have earned it through sex work.
So it's like their poverty automatically made them suspect
Exactly.
in the eyes of society.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that Rubenhold, she dug a little bit deeper into the inquest testimony and found that a woman named Ellen Holland, who knew Polly, actually testified that Polly was terrified of what she called a fast life,
Mm.
and that she had actually been trying to pawn a bonnet, which was likely her only possession of value, to get that DOS money.
So it was really just basic survival, not some, immoral act, as the authorities were kind of suggesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this really underscores one of the key points that Rubenhold makes throughout the book, which is that labeling these women as prostitutes really served to kind of distance them from respectable society
Yeah.
and ultimately devalue their lives. And this is, sadly, a pattern that we continue to see today.
Oh, absolutely. We see it all the time, how quick judgments are made about victims of violence, especially if they are women from marginalized communities.
Mhm.
Their choices are scrutinized, their character is questioned, all instead of focusing on the perpetrator.
Exactly. And it's a way of kind of shifting the blame, right? Making it easier to just dismiss the crime and its impact.
Let's shift gears a bit and talk about the realities of Victorian England, particularly for working class women. What were their options if they found themselves in poverty?
Yeah. I mean, the picture was pretty bleak. The workhouse system, which is often touted as kind of a safety net, was really designed to be so harsh that people would choose to do almost anything to avoid it.
I think we've all kind of, heard about these like grim conditions in the workhouses. Can you give us a picture of what that actually meant for someone like Polly Nichols?
I mean, just imagine being forced to do grueling labor, separated from your family, and living in absolute squalor. The food was meager, the punishments were severe. It was essentially a prison for the poor.
Yeah, I'm starting to understand why someone would choose almost anything over that.
And Polly's story illustrates this. She, after leaving her husband, did end up in the workhouse, but the conditions were so bad that she turned to casual wards and lodging houses, places that at least offered a roof over her head, even if it meant facing social stigma.
So it was really a direct result of the lack of options and the brutal reality of poverty.
Precisely. And it wasn't just the workhouses. Societal norms at the time really dictated that a woman needed a man for survival, for financial and social survival. And this left women like Polly incredibly vulnerable when they found themselves alone.
So it's like a system that was designed to keep women trapped.
In many ways, it was. And this brings us to another key point that Rubenhold makes, which is that we can't understand these women's lives without understanding the constraints that were placed on them by these Victorian gender roles.
Right.
They were constantly navigating this system that was limiting their choices and judging them harshly for any perceived transgression.
It's like they were damned if they did and damned if they didn't.
Exactly. And this is where that label of, prostitute becomes even more insidious. It's a way to control women. It's a way to punish them for not conforming to society's expectations.
So we're seeing how poverty and these Victorian gender roles were really intertwined
Mm.
and creating this web of constraints that these women had to navigate.
Hmm.
And this is all before we even get to Jack the Ripper.
Right. We have to remember that these women were already struggling to survive within a system that was offering them very little support and was oftentimes actively working against them.
Yeah, a really important context to keep in mind as we, delve deeper into their individual stories.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really fascinating. By looking beyond the label, beyond the sensationalism, we can start to see these women as individuals with their own unique experiences and aspirations and challenges.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to move beyond the generalizations and explore the lives of these women in more detail.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the lives of the 5 women murdered by Jack the Ripper. We've talked about, the societal context, the poverty, those Victorian gender roles, all those pressures they were facing. But now let's look beyond the generalizations, let's delve into their individual stories using the archival research that Rubenhold has put together.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get to know these women as people, beyond just the sensationalized headlines and all that.
Exactly. And I think one of the things that Rubenhold does so well is highlight their agency, their constant attempts to improve their lives despite the odds stacked against them.
Yeah, that comes through really clearly.
Yeah.
Let's start with Annie Chapman, the second victim. We touched on her tragic family life in the last part. But, what else do we know about Annie? Like, what can we glean from the research about her as a person?
Well, despite all the hardships that she faced, she clearly had this zest for life. And there's this interesting anecdote about a cabinet photo that she took with her husband, John, where they're dressed in their finest clothes.
It wasn't just a casual snapshot.
No. It seems like they went to a professional photographer, for this. And it really speaks to their aspirations, their desire to capture a moment of happiness and maybe even project an image of the life that they hoped for.
It makes you wonder, like, what were they talking about as they were, posing for that photo?
Right.
What dreams were they sharing?
Yeah. It's a poignant reminder that their lives weren't just about, this poverty and hardship. They had hopes and dreams just like anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And this desire for a better life, I think that's a thread that runs through many of these women's stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's talk about Elizabeth Stride next. Her journey from rural Sweden to London just sounds incredibly challenging. What can you tell us about her?
Elizabeth's story is one of remarkable resilience. I mean, she navigated multiple languages, cultures. She worked as a domestic servant and even dealt with a syphilis diagnosis, which carried immense social stigma at the time.
It's amazing that she managed to create a life for herself.
Right.
In a completely new country, right?
Right.
That takes incredible strength and adaptability.
It does. And she wasn't just passively accepting those circumstances. She married a carpenter, John Stride. They even opened a coffee shop together.
Wow, a coffee shop owner.
Yeah.
That's a far cry from the image of, the helpless, fallen woman.
Exactly. Elizabeth's story really challenges those simplistic labels. This was a woman who sought stability, who worked hard, who tried to build a better future for herself.
It's inspiring, really. She wasn't defined by her circumstances or by societal expectations.
Yeah. And then we have Kate Eddowes. Her story offers another glimpse into the aspirations of these women.
What was it about Kate's life that stood out to you?
Well, she had this fascinating experience as a child. She went to this school, the Dowgate School in London, and she actually got to visit the Crystal Palace during the Great Exhibition of 1851.
The Crystal Palace. Wow. That architectural marvel showcasing inventions and, artistry from around the world. That must have been an overwhelming experience for a young girl from a working class background.
I know, right? Imagine young Kate Eddowes surrounded by these dazzling displays of technology and culture. It's easy to imagine her imagination being sparked, her horizons expanding.
Right. It makes you wonder if that experience, planted a seed, a desire for something more than the limited options that society was offering her.
It's certainly possible, and it speaks to a broader point that these women weren't just these, passive victims. They had experiences, dreams, aspirations that transcended their difficult circumstances.
There were individuals, yeah, with these rich inner lives, not just names on a list.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And even with Mary Jane Kelly, the 5th victim, about whom we have the fewest details, we can find these hints of um, her yearning for stability and connection.
She was the youngest, right? And her murder was particularly brutal.
She was. And while there's much we don't know about her, we do know that she tried to create a home with Joseph Barnett. They may not have been legally married, but they presented themselves as a couple.
So even in her short life, she was seeking that sense of belonging,
Yeah.
that human connection that's so essential.
Absolutely. And it just reinforces this idea that despite their different backgrounds, their different experiences, these women shared a common desire for a better life, for love, for security.
It's heartbreaking to think that their lives were cut short before they could achieve those dreams.
It is. But I think by focusing on their individual stories, by acknowledging their agency and their humanity, we can honor their memory in a way that goes beyond just labeling them as victims.
Yeah. It feels like we're finally doing justice to these women, seeing them as they truly were.
And in doing so, we're also challenging the narrative that has so often been used to define them, a narrative that unfortunately continues to plague our understanding of violence against women today.
That's a powerful point. We've come a long way in understanding the lives of these 5 women. But it's clear that there are larger lessons to be learned here, lessons that go way beyond the specific case of Jack the Ripper.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at the legacy of these murders, the persistence of victim blaming, and what we can do to challenge these harmful narratives.
So we've really spent this deep dive getting to know Polly, Annie, Elizabeth Kate, and Mary Jane, as individuals, as women striving for a better life in, those really harsh realities of Victorian England.
It has been. It's been a journey uncovering their stories. But now I think we need to kind of confront the aftermath, the lingering impact of these murders and the disturbing persistence of victim blaming.
You're right. It's easy to get caught up in the individual stories and kind of forget about the fact that these murders sparked this widespread fear and moral panic.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of that fear was directed at the women themselves and the community they lived in.
Yeah. Rubenhold highlights this in her book with this really chilling example, this letter that was written to the Times shortly after Annie Chapman's murder.
Oh, yeah. The letter from Edward Fairfield.
That's right.
A civil servant.
A civil servant, yeah. And it's just a stark reminder of the prejudices of the time. I mean, he was more worried about those, quote, vicious inhabitants of Whitechapel being, displaced and bringing their taint to his neighborhood than he was about the women who were being murdered.
It's horrifying to think that someone could be so callous, so, lacking in empathy. Yeah. But it reveals this deep-seated bias against the poor, and particularly women living in poverty.
Yeah.
They were seen as a problem to be contained, not as individuals deserving of, compassion or justice.
And that dehumanization, that labeling, that's what allowed this cycle of victim blaming to continue.
Right.
It's easier to dismiss someone as a prostitute than to actually confront the systemic issues that contributed to their vulnerability.
Absolutely. By focusing on, the supposed immorality of the victims, society could kind of avoid addressing those larger problems of poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity for women.
And isn't that a pattern that we still see today?
Sadly, yes.
Women who are victims of violence are often judged and scrutinized. Their choices and actions are dissected in a way that their attackers, rarely are.
Right. And it's a way of shifting the blame. It's a way of making it easier to dismiss the crime and its impact. And it's especially prevalent when the victim is from a marginalized community.
So what can we learn from these tragic stories? How can we honor the memory of these women and ensure that their lives aren't, forgotten?
Well, I think awareness is key. We need to understand the historical context, the societal forces that shape their lives, and the dangers of labeling and dehumanizing victims.
And we need to apply that awareness to the present.
Right.
We need to challenge those victim-blaming narratives, in all their forms, and fight for a society that values the lives and experiences of all women.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their circumstances or choices.
Yeah, and it's also about remembering the individuals, right? Their unique stories, their hopes, their struggles.
Exactly. And Rubenhold does this in her book. She includes these poignant lists of the few belongings that were found with the victims: a black straw bonnet, a worn-out overcoat, a few buttons, a comb. these meager possessions, the things they clung to, are just this tangible reminder of their humanity.
I always find those lists so powerful.
Yeah.
You know, they're like a window into their lives, their struggles, their hopes.
They challenge us to think about the lasting impact of violence, not just on the victims themselves, but on the fabric of society.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've gone from, the sensationalized headlines to the personal stories, from assumptions to this, much deeper understanding of these women as individuals.
Yeah. And I hope that by exploring their lives, by acknowledging their humanity, we've challenged some of those harmful narratives that continue to surround victims of violence, and
Right.
particularly women.
To you, our listener, I'll leave you with this. Challenge your own biases. Question the narratives you encounter. And fight for a world where every woman's life is valued and respected.